Everybody, really, of a whole generation of collectors certainly knows the name Rosalie Whyel. And even new generation of collectors have learned to understand the importance that she brought to the doll world in the, late 80s all the way up into the 2000s 2012, I believe, when the museum closed that she founded in Bellevue, Washington, the Rosalie Whyel Museum of Doll Art. Now, this was not just any museum. This was the destination in the world for doll collectors because Rosalie built not only an incredible vision in her depiction of the doll as a work of art throughout history, but built a beautiful building and museum to house it that I really think gave respect, value, let me just say a validation to dolls as a work of art. We cannot stress the importance of what this museum had in the history of dolls and what Rosalie Whyel contributed and why she is by far one of the most beloved figures in the world. Barry Altz has had a long association with Rosalie through the time that she started collecting. I remember first starting my career in the late 80s, and I met Rosalie in Louisville, Kentucky at a regional convention, and I remember talking to her and meeting her for the first time, and she told me that she has this vision that she's going to build a museum. Now, I heard that a lot over the years from different people, and it typically doesn't happen. Boy, was I wrong. She not only built a museum, but built the finest in the world, and one that I think will be remembered 100 to 200 years from now. People will go back and talk about how that museum was a turning point in the world of dolls. Well, Barry Altz has a special relationship as well in that in January of 2024, we offered the first part of the Rosalie Whyel Museum at auction, a testament to the importance of the dolls she had and the love that collectors had in wanting a piece of that museum and something that Rosalie had protected, was that it became the highest grossing doll auction in world history. That was just part one. And then in part two of this event, which is being held in January of 2025, we will see even more fabulous pieces. With that, though, I wanted to give a lot of people here an opportunity today to learn about Rosalie, the person, learn about what was the catalyst for her collecting, what really drove this vision. And also for those who never went to the museum, who never got to meet her or talk to her personally, maybe to have an intimate time in realizing the behind the scenes aspect of what went into this over the years. As such, I am so honored to bring in Shelley Helzer, the daughter of Rosalie Whyel, as my very first guest on The Curious Collector. And we will be doing a two-part podcast. This will be part one here today, and then come back next Tuesday for part two. That will discuss all of these stories behind the museum and stories about Rosalie. Shelley, I want to say welcome, and I'm so happy you're here.
Oh, thank you, Stuart. It's great to be here. What a great introduction of my mom in the museum.
Oh, well, I could go on for hours, and I probably will. But we've known each other over the years. We've kind of grown up in the world of dolls together. We met really for the first time, though, where we had sort of proper conversations, unfortunately, after your mom passed away and when you were faced with this decision. And I have to say, these last 2 years, we've worked together quite a bit. I've sort of had a second home in Seattle. And we've bonded in ways that have really been special for me in developing the understanding of your mom and also learning a lot about you. I mean, I have to say, we first bonded over our love of the TV show Friends. And we would laugh as we're working in the warehouses, unveiling the dolls, that whenever we hit a hard spot in what we were doing, we were like, we used that old line from Friends. It's from one of the classic episodes. And we were like, pivot.
Pivot.
And so it's been great working with you. And I've really enjoyed this process and enjoyed unveiling again the dolls. I would love for you to share with people a little bit more about your mom. I mean, her story is an incredible one.
It
It's the
is.
American story in a lot of ways. And she
Absolutely.
was a young girl growing up in Alaska. And I'm not
Hmm.
talking about Anchorage, I'm talking about
Mm-mm.
the interior of Alaska,
Hmm.
near the mining regions outside of
Hmm.
Fairbanks. Kind of take us back in time, your memories and the stories you know about her growing up then.
Well, that could be a whole series of podcasts in itself, but we're Alaskans through and through. My grandparents immigrated there during the Depression from Washington State. And so my mom was born there, and you're right, she was born in the middle of nowhere, not far outside of the national park there in a mining town. She was the youngest one in the town. My grandma always said that going to Alaska was the adventure of her life. I think my mom would agree with that, and for herself and even for us. And she was the youngest, so she got the benefits of that and was always going to the little schoolhouse there, trying to knock her way in, knocking on the door. Can I come in? Even though she wasn't old enough to go to school. And they let her go into school and come and participate in class. And she also had what I think kind of started sparking this fascination with dolls is that as the other kids in the camp grew up, their parents or even just the children themselves would give their dolls to my mom as they quote unquote outgrew them.
Oh,
And
wow.
so I think that's a little bit what started it. But she had a wonderful childhood. It was rough, but in such a good way that makes you a tough individual, makes you smart, streetwise smart. And then when she was about 7 or 8, they moved to the big town of Fairbanks so that she, and with my grandma and her brother, could go to a bigger school. And we just had the best growing up. That's where I grew up. I was born in Fairbanks, and my brothers and sisters, we were all born there and grew up there in just the best childhood. I was outside all the time, and that generation, and even still up there, it is kind of like that, like be home for dinner at 6. Otherwise, you're off on your own, and good luck to you, and hope to see you at dinner time.
I don't think I want to be out and about after dark in some of those places in Alaska. So,
Oh, it's the
as a
best. It's
child,
the best. No, we loved it. We loved it.
oh,
We had this great, big, huge neighborhood, and my mom was just the best mom. I was kind of a wild child, so she was the best mom for me. She kind of let me do my thing, but then reined me in when I was getting a little bit out of control. But it was great. And she had this couple of cases with dolls, and I think we all kind of knew it was a little odd, but nothing out of the ordinary. That was just life. And then as you moved out, your room became a doll room, and it
oh, it's
just,
every child of a collector's story. I wasn't
yeah,
gone a week before they changed my room into a doll room. So I
exactly,
get that. I was
exactly.
laughing at you saying your mother was the youngest child
Yeah.
in town, and I was thinking, well, there were only 8 people, so that wasn't difficult, probably. But
It was a
I
little
love
bigger
that.
than that, but not much.
I love the story that people would just give her dolls there. I always am fascinated by the origins of collectors, nostalgic and emotional links to their childhood. And that had to be the beginning when people would give her these dolls and she would
Mm.
be the protector,
Yeah,
basically, of
yeah.
everyone else's dolls. And it must have led to something. So that was really, really fascinating. She actually kind of going through the period when you were growing up with this and your siblings as well. I should mention that you have 2 sisters as well and a brother. I've met all of them. It's a wonderful family, folks. I can tell
Oh,
you
thank
that. It's
you.
an amazing family that was very supportive of the museum and their
Hmm.
mom's wild vision of this taking root in eventually Seattle. But she really did start seriously collecting in Alaska. And a lot of people don't
Hmm.
realize that. I mean, when she first started buying from Thurialts in the 80s, she was living in Fairbanks.
Yeah, I mean, and most
Yeah.
of the dolls that she bought were through you guys and through mail order. And we had our little days. My mom would be like, okay, tomorrow's auction day. So I'll be in my bedroom on the phone and no one comes in. No one comes in. You weren't allowed to knock. I mean, you better be bleeding profusely. Those were special days. And we were like, okay. And then a few weeks later, a bunch of packages would arrive and we'd watch her unveil and she'd show us what she got. And we would always ask after the auction, were you successful? Yep, I sure was. So it was always really fun. And what a lot of people probably don't know about Alaska is and I think which contributed to her love is that it's very art and history focused. There's a lot of art there, a lot of museums. People really, really love the arts, all sorts of arts, music and fine art and dance, and it's very supported. So I grew up going to all these concerts and museums, even there, and then when we would travel. And so I think that is how it started for my mom there, her love of children, art, and history. I mean, what better way to intertwine than antique dolls?
Oh, that's great. And I've heard
Mhm.
that about Fairbanks, that it was a really like they had one of the earliest theaters in the frontier really out there when it was first
Mhm.
settled. And I've heard it a very cultural city in a lot of ways.
Mhm.
The,
That's right.
what was it like the moment? I'm just trying to think of what you felt when your mother walked in the house one day in Fairbanks and said, I've decided I want to open a museum, a doll
Well,
museum.
early on, she had a really sophisticated collection. She liked rare things. The idea was actually not from my mom, it was from my stepdad, George. They had decided that we were going to move either to California or to Washington. And then they settled on Bellevue because we have a lot of roots here in Washington with my grandparents having come from here after immigrating from Italy. And so he thought, what are you going to do there? And she was like, yeah, what am I going to do there? And so he's like, you should open a museum. And she was like, oh, that's silly. And but then she kind of started saying that to people, especially Doll Club, and they're like, you should. You like rare things. You have wonderful things. You should share them. And so she kind of started thinking about that. And as we were making our transition from Fairbanks to Seattle, she found it to be a kind of a sleepy town at the time. I mean, at night they used to set the street lights to just blink on red. That's how what a ghost town it was. And man, has it changed since then.
Oh, yeah.
And so she started thinking about this, but my mom never does anything halfway. And so she was like, if I'm going to do this, it's going to be really, really top notch and really showcase these things that she thought were just incredible and beautiful and had astonishing kind of histories and stories beyond what I think just a regular layperson would give them credit for.
I guess you touched on something that always stuck with me in this is that doll collectors over the years come up with the idea of building a museum. Maybe 2% of the people who ever come up with the idea actually do it. And oftentimes it's more casual. As you said, she didn't do things halfway. She went all the
Hmm.
way. And that was the thing
Hmm.
that was, I think, the most surprising for everyone. This was a building that was constructed specifically for this museum.
Hmm.
It was
Yeah.
not in a strip mall. It was not in a barn in the backyard. It was
Hmm.
an impressive architecturally designed building that was the first ever to be constructed for such a purpose. And I think
Hmm.
that it wasn't just the rare dolls that she had, but she built a venue that was world class. She built a building that was world class.
Hmm.
So I'm glad you touched on that because I think it's really an important aspect of what made this place so special. And you're right, Bellevue has, wow, we used to go back there in the beginning when the museum opened, go there and, it was a burgeoning town, but it was still a town kind of feel. Now it's a city. It's certainly changed over the years. All your family, I mean, your siblings and you, everyone was really kind of thrust into this life in the museum. And I imagine, because I think when you came to Bellevue, you were in high school or
Yep,
middle
that's
school.
right. Yeah. High
Yeah.
school. Mm.
So you entered into Bellevue High, and you're known as the girl whose parents own a doll museum. I grew up as the guy whose parents owned a doll auction house. So
Yeah.
we both took our bruises over that over the years. But
Yeah.
my point being, must have been absolutely fascinating to grow up in this. And then not only did you all grow up in this, but then, Shelley, your own children grew up in the museum as well. Two of them, I believe, did. Tell me what it was like in the beginning working with your mom in this, because you used to come in all the time and then eventually you turned your entire career into supporting her in the museum and the doll business.
Yes. Well, so I was in high school and I was kind of doing my own thing and my mom was doing her thing, you're a teenager, not really paying attention. And I thought it was interesting and cool. And, we'd grown up going to museums our whole life. So it wasn't really a huge stretch, maybe for other families. But speaking of the strip malls, like I've been to the strip mall doll museums. We've done
Mm.
all that and we've been to world-class museums. And so I had no doubt my mom was very intentional and would be intentional in how she designed it and the tribute she was paying to what she was creating. And I guess I didn't really think too much about it until like while I was in college and I was studying business. And then to me, the business part really spoke to me. My mom was running this all by herself. She'd run other businesses before. And so I was really taking an interest in it, trying to apply what I was learning. And I thought, oh, after graduation, I'll go. And she had offered to have me work with her. And I was working during the summers, obviously, at the museum. And I thought I'll work there a few years and then I'll go off and do my own thing. But I ended up just really loving the museum and what we were doing and working with my mom, which I was kind of surprised about, to tell you the truth. And she was also
Oh,
surprised that we got along so well together because it can be hard working with family.
oh, we'll tell some secrets about working for mom later, okay? Because I've got
Yeah,
mine
that's right.
too.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's right. But I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed our staff, the people we worked with, and I enjoyed having people come in. It was such a diverse place because a lot of collectors from around the world, Australia, Europe, all over the US, like you said, this was kind of the Mecca, and they would come and it meant something to them. But then we'd also get families of generations, 3 generations, sometimes 4 generations of people
Hmm.
coming, and maybe a lady who was interested with their husband, or, just school groups. Everything was just so many different kinds of people came through the door. It was really fascinating to see what they saw and how they saw what, you and I know as this fun niche collecting, and really having a respect for what it brought out, memories of childhood, of things they hadn't thought about, of maybe their parents, their mom, their grandma. It was so interesting that I immediately got hooked and decided to stay. And it was also a creative endeavor, which I think, being kind of an art focused family, that was nice to have on a daily basis, to have that.
It's so interesting because you and I think we bonded through this process in sharing
Hmm.
the dolls. But I think a lot of it is also that though I came a little bit earlier than you came later on, you're younger. Notice I say that with bitterness.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes,
You're welcome.
our careers, our trajectories have pretty much been the same. Because it's so
Mhm.
funny listening to you talk about this, and I realized we never have before that. Growing up with your mom in the doll world and the doll business, you didn't really think much of. I never imagined it was what I wanted to do or was going to do
Mhm.
growing up. It was just, as you said, it was her thing.
Mhm.
And exactly the same as you, it was when I went off to
Mhm.
college. And then of course, when I got my first job and realized, oh my gosh, what an incredible business and world and life
Mhm.
and people involved in it. And I
Mhm.
want back. I want in. Now I
Mhm.
see it for what it is, and it's exactly the same as you. And we learn to love the subject through the business and the people.
Yeah.
So it's incredible. Your other
Mhm.
siblings, I know they were all involved as well in some ways, helping out. And it was a great family affair. It really was. And what you said too was right on that all of the museums before, and I'm absolutely supportive to people who open up a little museum in their community as best they
Yes.
can.
Yep.
Any exposure is fabulous, and we support and love what you're doing. But
Mhm.
this was a first time that we had a museum that you're right, that brought in people who were, let's call them the others, the non collectors, because
Yeah.
it was in a
Yeah.
beautiful building. It was in a nice part of town. It was kind of a good Sunday outing kind of place to go to, or Saturday outing with your family. It allowed the others to come and gave
Mhm.
them a home to see dolls in a new perspective. Your mom was a pioneer in that because now that's
Yeah.
becoming a thing. And the
Yes.
Barry Art Museum in Norfolk, as an example, now we're seeing art museums introduce doll
Yes.
wings. And this never would have
Mhm.
happened without your mom. She brought that to us. The museum really was the vision of your mother, and she did this, and she was there from the day one when they broke ground until the end. And that
Hmm.
was one of the great parts of going to that museum was often you would walk in and there would be Rosalie right there.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
collectors would tell me that they were like astonished, like, oh my gosh, she's standing right here waiting for me. And she wouldn't just greet them. She would walk around and talk to people and show
Hmm.
them different things, tell the stories, and it gave an immersive feeling when you went there. You weren't just walking around blindly looking at objects that you knew nothing about. A lot of times, Rosalie was there sharing the
Hmm.
stories directly and teaching people. And I always thought that was a great thing. But there were other people involved in this museum too, other people that were really important to her and important to the museum's evolution over the years.
Hmm.
Are there some people that you recall that were really a part of this with her?
We were so blessed. We had such an amazing staff and people we met. We started out Susan and Base Hedrick. Susan is still in the doll world. And actually, ironically, almost every employee that we had actually either lived at some point or was from Alaska. So we always had this connection.
Oh,
But
gosh.
Susan and Basil Hedrick, they had worked in Alaska in Fairbanks. Susan had a doll shop. I can remember as a little kid going in there and picking out toys. I got my Cabbage Patch dolls from there. Actually, everybody, when that craze, like she couldn't keep them in stock. I remember that very vividly. She ended up being our first curator, and Base did a lot of our advertising and marketing for us. And they had worked for the University of Alaska Fairbanks Museum. So they had lots of experience and they were wonderful. And Eleanor Miller was our accountant. She was a collector. So most of our staff were obviously also doll collectors. She was also from Fairbanks. Her daughter Christina worked for us later in the same capacity. We had a photographer. If you've seen our books, especially The Rose Unfolds, Charlie Backus, he was our first photographer and he was amazing. And he had never photographed dolls. He was a professional photographer, but he ended up knowing so much. It was amazing. Before we had the museum, we had an entire photo studio down in the bottom of our house, which was where my bedroom was. And I would wake up 7 a.m., 9 a.m., whatever, come out in my PJs. There's Charlie setting up dolls, taking photos. And good morning, Charlie. Good morning, Charlie. So
Oh, wait, the studio was in your house, not,
it
I was
was
thinking in the
in
basement of the museum in the house. Oh
No,
my
it was
gosh.
while the museum was getting built, or even while we were acquiring the property. It took over
Gosh.
a year and a half, I think, to go from start to the opening of the museum. And so, yeah, he was there every weekday. I still have friends that are like, "Remember when I'd spend the night and that guy Charlie would be there?" And I go, "Yeah,
Poor Charlie. If he's
yeah, I
listening to
know."
this, he's probably like, oh my gosh, how
I know. He
embarrassing.
was so tired of
All right.
teenage girls. He's like, okay, I'm just trying to photo some dolls here, people. Time went on to a lot of amazing dealers like Yvonne Baird and Richard Wright, and they would bring dolls to us when they saw what my mom, especially after the museum was open, what she had created. And like you said, really took this as a serious art form. And they would bring
Mhm.
things and be like, this is super important. This needs to be in a museum. And well, that's all you needed to say. Those are the kinds of things my mom loved. Important,
Right.
rare stories. So I've just met so many wonderful, cherished peoples. I mean, I love going to National Convention, UFDC, and seeing everyone. And it's really a highlight to me. Doll Club, I love it. I get to meet all these wonderful women and men that just have fascinating lives. Everybody's so different, but we all
The
come
characters
together
in
with this.
collecting, people don't
Mm-hmm.
realize, and I'm hoping to have more and more collectors on interviews on the Curious Collector
Yes.
because I think people should learn the really diverse backgrounds of everyone involved in dolls. You have
Yeah.
entertainers, you have the young girl who grew up in the frontier of Alaska, you've got all these different people with backgrounds, all loving the same object, but doing it through a different eye and a different history. And you're right, it's an incredible thing. I was laughing when you said you were buying your Cabbage Patches in Fairbanks from Susan Hedrick. I never knew she had a doll shop there. I had no
She
concept.
did.
Now I know why I get so many calls from Fairbanks of people that want to sell their Cabbage Patch dolls. But uh,
It's true. If Tiffany calls you, she lived up the hill from me and she had like 21 of them and I only had two. And I was like,
I'm going
ah.
to check. I may have a lead here from Tiffany for
Okay.
Cabbage Patches. So anyway, everybody was jealous of Tiffany at the time,
Oh,
I
yeah.
bet.
She had them all lined up in
Okay.
her room. I can see it right now.
Oh, that's funny. You talked about your mom and how she loved the art of the doll and loved the stories, but Shelley, she had to have one favorite, one doll that really
Mm.
resonated, really, I mean, that everybody who came to the museum, when she walked around, she would take them to and say, this is the one.
Well, I think like a lot of collectors, I mean, I see this in myself and I see it in a lot of people that I know. You evolve. And I can remember growing up, and as you know, she had many a bidding war with you guys. The K-Star Germans were just what she absolutely loved, which knowing my mom, I always thought was odd because they were very art, that character movement. And she was such a fun, childish person herself. She was goofy and wonderful.
Mhm.
And I thought that's odd, but she loved the character movement. Other dolls that maybe weren't K-Star R's, but mimicked or had that same feeling, some of those high-end AMs. So growing up, that was for sure what she was trying to do. She was trying to be a very complete collector and get that entire series, and she succeeded very well at that if you went to the museum. But then she started buying woodens, and I remember having a conversation after she had acquired a few, and she just had paused and was like, I never in my entire life thought I would own something this amazing and early and special. And so she really sought to get a very wide range collection of woodens as she did. And she wrote about in
Which
her book
inspired
with
her
Jill.
book. Yeah.
Yeah, that she wrote with Jill Gorman, which is an amazing book.
The Heart of
But
the
she just,
Tree, for anyone who
the heart of
doesn't
the
have it.
tree.
It's a fabulous title and one of the go-to books in the world on English woodens, for sure.
Yes. And there really wasn't much information either on them. And she started this prior to a lot of internet availability, but she loved rare things. That's what she really loved. She got inspired by things she'd never seen before. And sometimes that came back to bite her because we'd be like, oh, this is the only one ever. And then, of course, when you have something like a museum, really like a couple more would come out of the woodworks. But it didn't matter. She liked those things. And I think that's also why she liked dolls that had stories, because if it had a
Hmm.
story, that was unique to that. That only this doll has that story. So she just really appreciated originality, rareness, things that had a history, because I think that's all the reason why she was a doll collector. She loved the art, she loved history, she loved children.
It's interesting because by the time you got to the mid to late 90s, the museum had taken on such a level of consciousness across the world of collecting that anyone who had a rare doll, they just go right to Rosalie first. I always joke that who was my biggest competitor in the 90s? Rosalie
Yeah,
Whyel.
it,
It's
totally.
like, yeah, don't bother calling Thury. I'll just go straight to Rosalie, which is interesting because I always encourage collectors. You should build your brand, and she really did
Hmm.
build kind of a
Hmm.
brand in what you
Hmm.
said, surrounding this museum with incredibly rare things, so that everybody thought of her as the go-to. We're going to end part one here, and we're going to come back next week and talk a little bit more about leading into the closing of the museum in 2012 and kind of this emotional moment, and
Hmm.
give you a chance to share some of your memories about that, and talking about the auction that was held last year and what your emotions were there. Come back and join us next week, everyone, for part two of an interview with Shelley Helzer, the daughter of the pioneer and great collector Rosalie Whyel, and we'll have more stories and conversation.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Curious Collector. The Curious Collector is hosted by Stuart Holbrook and produced by Tammy Trujillo. We invite you to follow us on social media and feel free to leave any questions you have for Stuart on Facebook at Stuart Holbrook-Therialts, or follow the Therialt Company Facebook page. And you can stay up to date with the latest auctions and events at Therialts.com. We'll talk to you on the next episode of The Curious Collector.